Evening, or good afternoon, good morning. Welcome wherever in the world you are. Welcome to the smallest show on earth, the history of the flea circus. It's great to see so many of you here. I can see the numbers clicking up now. Just while we're giving people a few moments to come and join, to sign in to the talk as they're filtering in through the virtual doors. Well, we're just going to say welcome to everybody and say thanks to a few people for setting this up. So first of all, thanks to the Edinburgh Science Festival. Make sure that you go and have a look at the other things that are going on as part of the Science Festival, and then also to the British Ecological Society for making all of this stuff happen, particularly to Chris Jeffs, who has put all of this stuff together. Now, we've got a few people behind the scenes, and so during the duration of this talk, so we're going to have about half an hour or so of me talking about some pretty interesting but pretty weird stuff, right? And it's all about joining in, so I'm really hoping that we get some amazing questions that we can answer at the end. There will be time for questions, and we've got Jamie, and we've got Chris, and we've got Robin, and we've got Elise behind the scenes wrangling all of your questions. And so I've just realized that I can't see your questions popping up on the chat box, but do fire away, do put them into that chat box, and then by the end we'll see how many of those we can get through. So we're going to have an interesting few minutes, an interesting half an hour or so in this brave new world. What an amazing new world, the world in which you can sit in your living room watching a talk. You can sit in your living room, the world in which you can sit in your living room watching a talk about fleas, and the world in which you don't know whether or not I'm wearing any trousers. I am wearing trousers, don't worry. It's not that kind of show. Right, so just before we launch into it, here we go. Hope you're all sitting comfortably. Do fire away with the questions and let's crack on. So I'm going to tell you about the smallest show on earth, the secrets of the flea circus. And I'm sure that's why all of you are here. But just before I do that, I thought it might be useful to tell you a little bit about who I am. So why is it me? Why am I telling you all about this this weird and wonderful topic, which I promised by the end. And I tell you what, just before I talk about myself, I'm going to make you a promise that by the end of this talk, I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you proof that it's possible to train a flea to jump through a hoop on command. And I'm also going to show you how a flea could make a Victorian lady take all of her clothes off, right? So if you're thinking of checking out, well, hopefully that's the best thing I can say to make you stick around for the next half an hour or so. So back to the talk about me. So why is it me telling you about fleas? My background. Now, I did a PhD in entomology, so I'm an entomologist by trade. My PhD was at the University of Cambridge, where I spent many, many months in the rainforest of Borneo studying the insects in the rainforest canopy. My PhD was in tropical insect ecology, so using insects to answer questions about ecosystems and all of the ways in which living things in ecosystems interact with each other. And while we're talking about ecosystems, of course, don't forget to subscribe to the British Ecological Society YouTube channel as well. So Ecosystems, insects, that's my background. And when I was there, I spent loads and loads of time studying some really amazing animals, all the wonderful things that you see in rainforests, taking photos of things like these. Of course, we get our orangutans and the clouded leopards, some really wonderful animals in Borneo. But the really interesting things for me are the insects. It's one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And of course, most animals in the world are in fact insects. So loads and loads of things, loads of very exciting insects and other invertebrates as well. Those are the things that are related to insects. So things like this, the spider that looks like birds' droppings. This is one thing that I took a photo of in Borneo. This is Phrynorachne decipens, which disguises itself as birds' droppings to avoid predators. I also spent a bit of time there training ants to spell the word ants. That took a long time there. Ants to spell the word. And of course, the other thing that you have to do when you go into the rainforest is take some photos of an insect that looks like Elvis. So there's the insect that looks like Elvis, the very famous Elvis Presley bug from Borneo. Okay, so a background as an entomologist, and that's why I like talking about fleas. Fleas are really, really kind of quirky animal. But also, I'm really interested in telling other people about insects. And so since my PhD, I started working in the media and making things. So this is me recording bees in Madagascar for BBC Radio 4. And then I've also done things on TV, presenting a program about spiders with Professor Alice Roberts, for example, a few years ago. And then since then, so as well as kind of making programs, I also work now loads behind the scenes as a scientific consultant on the subject of entomology for natural history documentaries. And that's why I'm in the salubrious settings of a hotel room in a secret location, because I'm on a natural history film shoot right now. So I will be training insects tomorrow, not fleas, but sadly I'm not allowed to tell you anything about it. And so working on set, in studios, on locations, and as that photo shows there, sadly we don't have time to go into telling you all about the story that I came to be lying on a beach in northern Borneo throwing frozen butterflies at Sir David Attenborough, but that's a whole different talk. So that's my background, talking about insects and studying insects in really interesting places and telling people all about them. But I do have another not so secret career. And so what I say to people usually is that by day, I'm an entomologist, and by night, I am a circus performer. And so this is, here's some photos of me from the Ripley's Believe It or Not annual a few years ago with my character, the Great Inferno, eating fire and chewing molten lead and doing really weird and wonderful things. I can't explain how I got into it. I've just always done these, both of these things, natural history and insects as well. And then also things like working in the street performing in York. And according to Ripley's Believe It or Not, I am officially unbelievably zany. I'll leave you to make your minds up about that one. But as part of this wonderful world of the circus and performing, there is this thing called the sideshow. Right now, it's a thing that not many people know much about nowadays, but it used to be a massively popular thing. And I'm part of a group of performers that recreate old-fashioned sideshows. So this is our wonderful Sideshow Illusions is the name of our group. And it's Dr. Phantasma's 10-in-1 sideshow here. So this is a recreation of an American 10-in-1 sideshow. And so if you went to a fairground or a circus or a sideshow up until the 1950s or the 1960s, you would see a show like this where you pay money to go and see weird and wonderful exhibits and weird and wonderful performers. This is another one of our shows from Sideshow Illusions. This is an original fairground sideshow from England from the 1950s, Mademoiselle Yvette, the Headless Lady, and we present these at festivals and shows around the country and around the world as well. And so really, there is this thing called the sideshow, but they kind of don't really exist anymore. One of those sideshows that used to be massively popular on most of the fairgrounds and circuses and seaside towns in the UK is this thing, and it's the thing called the Flea Circus. Now, when I first heard about this thing called the Flea Circus, I thought, finally, I've got that thing that combines my love of insects with my love of circus and sideshows, this really strange thing called the Flea Circus, right? Now, it might be a thing that many people have heard of. Loads of people have heard of the Flea Circus. And when I was a teenager and the first time I heard about it, I told my mates, I've heard of this thing called the Flea Circus. And they knew of it. They knew it was a thing. But all of my mates were convinced that the Flea Circus was not a genuine show. They were convinced that it was a kind of magician's trick or maybe a little bit of a joke. Now, I started to ask other people about the Flea Circus, and this really is the story of my journey into discovering the world of the Flea Circus. Now, One person that I asked about this, now sadly she is no longer with us, but my grandmother, I asked my grandma about flea circuses. She was in her 80s at the time, and she'd been to this fair here. So this is a fairground. This is a photo of Hull Fair. Now Hull Fair, from my hometown of Kingston upon Hull in East Yorkshire, Hull Fair is Europe's largest travelling fair, and it's been going for years and years, for literally hundreds of years. Now, when my grandma was a young girl in the 1930s, she went to Hull Fair. It didn't look like this. It probably looked something a bit more like this this next photo here, with steam-powered rides, steam-powered gallopers, and the fairground organs provided the music. And when she went to the fairground, she saw a flea circus, and she was swearing. She could swear that the flea circus that she'd seen contained real live performers. So fleas performing tricks in the circus, and that's what she went to pay her sixpence for. And so as soon as I heard about this, I was thinking, guys, my grandma just getting a little bit old. Is she going doolally? Has she remembered something that didn't actually exist? And that set me on a journey to discover the secrets of the flea circus and to find out whether the flea circus is or was a real thing. And that's what I'm going to tell you about over the next few minutes. Now, the start of my research was looking at contemporary flea circuses. So there are flea circuses that exist now. And I'm just going to show you a video of a modern flea circus. It's a friend of mine.
Wow, look at that, up in the air.
So here's Professor John's show. Now, Professor John is a really good friend of mine, and he is one of the best showmen in the world. And if you go to watch Professor John's Flea Circus, you will laugh out loud, you will be entertained. And I really recommend going to have a look at Sideshow Illusions at John's website, where you can book John's Flea Circus. But watching videos like that and watching performances, they're brilliantly, fantastically entertaining. But I couldn't see any real fleas. And so the mystery still remains. Are the fleas real, or is it all an illusion? Now, the next step in my research was that I managed to get hold of a flea circus that somebody had made. It was a very recent flea circus, and this is a picture of the flea circus that I managed to get hold of. And I will give the game away a little bit in that when I examined this flea circus, well, I couldn't see any real fleas, and there were no real fleas involved in this specific thing here. So there were perhaps some magnets and some hidden wires that give the illusion of fleas actually existing. Okay, so there is this performance, sometimes performed by magicians. There is a bit of a magician's trick. Brilliant shows, really entertaining, but I think most of the time real fleas are not involved. And so I was not getting any closer to the truth. Did the flea circus really once exist? These flea circuses on fairgrounds, in sideshows, were there real human fleas actually involved? And so I turned to some historical research. Okay, so this is a close-up of the Flea Circus box that I bought, and it didn't give me any clues. So I turned to a bit of historical research, and I started to collect old postcards. And so here's some brilliant characters here. This is Professor Wood's Flea Circus and the amazing Professor Ronker, fantastically named. Some of these are from England from the 1930s. This one here is from Hubert's Museum from Times Square in New York that ran for decades and decades up until relatively recently. Professor W. Heckler's Trained Flea Circus. And there's another souvenir from Heckler's Flea Circus down there. But really, most of these postcards, and certainly the things that came next, the things that I collected next, loads of evidence that these flea circuses used to exist. This is a poster from around 1905 of Professor William Frick's Flea Circus. And here's one on the right-hand side. This is from Scarborough on the east coast of Yorkshire. Professor Axel's Performing Fleas, using only the genuine European human fleas, that one from the US there. And these things came up again and again, and there were references to the flea ballet, to the flea chariot race. These things kept popping up again and again, but they're engravings, they're posters, they're printed things. They don't give me any solid evidence as to whether or not these fleas were actually there, whether they were actually involved. And so I carried on collecting. I found even more things there as well. This is a Victorian engraving from a Victorian magazine in the 1870s with this depiction of a flea circus, really wonderful pieces of artwork. This one, a ticket, a very rare ticket from an original flea circus from Skegness on the Lincolnshire coast. And then this one on the right-hand side here, this flea circus from Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen. This is the Torp family flea circus. And so we've got all of these bits of evidence here that flea circuses used to exist, but still no clue as to whether or not they were the genuine article. So were these flea circuses real or were they not? My quest continued. Now, luckily, in the Flea Circus from Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen. These, by the way, were all postcards that would have been sold at the Flea Circus. So you went to see the fleas and then you'd buy one of these postcards as a souvenir afterwards. Now, this wasn't just a single postcard. This was actually a series of postcards all joined together. And so the next postcard along, so it starts off with this wonderful image there of the fleas dressed in their Sunday best going to the flea circus. And then this next image here was a photograph of the inside of this family's flea circus. And we can see these things at the top, those things that had been mentioned in the posters that I showed you just a few photos ago of the tricycle, the fleas pulling chariots and the fleas pulling carriages. But we can see pictures, and I think they look like fleas to me, but I'm not 100% sure. They're just little black blobs there, aren't they? However, the last photograph in this series of postcards gave me the final clue that I needed, that fleas used to be involved in the genuine flea circus. This is Miss Babette, the tightrope walking flea from Torp's Flea Circus in Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen. And I can tell you from my entomological background, with my entomological experience, that this is a genuine human flea with a collar tied around her neck, walking upside down on the tightrope. Now, I was pretty much convinced, 99% convinced, that this flea circus used to be a real thing on the fairgrounds. And then I asked a friend of mine, Vanessa Toulmin, Professor Vanessa, who was then director of the National Fairground Archive at the University of Sheffield. And she showed me this film. And so it comes with thanks to Professor Vanessa, this film of a flea circus, probably from around the post-Second World War. And this is a newsreel clip. So this is the thing that would have been played in between films. So if you went to the cinema, you would have a film, you would watch a film, and then there'd be this newsreel played in between. And this is from a fairground. We saw people gambling on rats in a race there. And then we see the flea circus. And just as you can see, all of those things that were described in those posters, we can see actual moving images of the fleas pulling chariots. So this is what we're watching now, tiny human fleas with a collar around their neck, all attached to tiny little vehicles, pulling them along. So a really amazing thing. And the final confirmation for me that the flea circus was a genuine thing. And so you can imagine from my my background, being interested in insects and being interested in showmanship and exhibitions and things like that, sideshows and fairgrounds, that I was absolutely hooked on the flea circus. And it was something that I had to know everything about, the secrets of the flea circus. And so convinced there, this is Samson, the strongman flea. And of course, by the end of it, everybody ends up itching. Now, when I do this talk in a room full of hundreds of people, well, usually about this point in the talk, well, somebody in the bottom right corner over there will just start to scratch away without really realizing it. They're watching the talk, they're enjoying it, they start to scratch. And then the person a few rows back starts to scratch. And about 15 or 20 minutes into the talk, well, I'm standing in front of a room of 100 or so people, all just itching and scratching without really realizing it. So if you do find yourselves scratching away throughout the period of the talk, well, don't worry, it's perfectly normal. Okay, so there's the flea circus. There's our proof that I think the flea circus genuinely existed. And so we've got some more photos here of, amazingly, of the flea circus that my grandma went to see when she was a young girl in the 1930s. And so this next image here is of Professor Testo's Flea Circus. Again, thanks very much to the National Fairground Archive for these images. Professor Testo's Flea Circus, which toured around all of the fairs in the UK for decades and decades. And so this is the show that my grandma went to see, some original photos from that show. And so it led to that question, how did the flea circus start? So we've got this thing that used to be a show, a really popular show. How on earth did it start? Who was the first person to decide to tie a collar around a flea and to charge people to come and watch it performing tricks? Well, that takes us back to 1578, right? So about 450 years ago. And delving through the historical records at the British Library, I found reference to a man called Mark Scalliot. Now, Mark Scalliot was a blacksmith in the 1570s. Sorry, let's just go back to the previous image there. So Mark Scalliot was a blacksmith in the 1570s. And there is a record of Mark Scalliot having made a chain that was so small that it could be pulled along by a single flea. We have a record of him actually doing this and putting it on display as an exhibition. So the first thing that where the flea circus started, the historical roots of the flea circus, were these exhibitions where blacksmiths and jewelers were making pieces of metalwork. Craftsmen were making these pieces of metalwork that were so small that they needed something familiar in order to show off just how small they were. And so Mark Scalliot attached his chain around the neck of a human flea, which pulled it along. So the original show was not about the fleas themselves. The original show was about these tiny pieces of jewelry, of craftsmanship, in order to display them to the public. Now, amazingly, this exhibition went on. We've got records of exactly this kind of exhibition existing on and off for the next 250 years. I think people didn't get out much in those days. And so for 250 years, popping up all over the UK and sometimes on the continent as well, there were these little exhibitions where you would see pieces of miniature craftsmanship with fleas attached, just to show how small these pieces of craftsmanship were. People got a little bit bored of them. They even became a term called a flea chain. So if you had a very tiny chain, it was called a flea chain. Now, people got bored of these, and they carried on and they carried on until one thing changed. Now, this image here is of a man called Luis Bertolotto, right? Now, in the 1830s, in 1831, this man came to England. Now, he took this show that had been going on for around 200 or 300 years by that point, and he added one extra ingredient. So he showed pretty much exactly the same exhibition, fleas attached to small props. And that ingredient that Bertolotto added was showmanship. And so rather than having the exhibition of tiny little chains and little things that I've made, Bertolotto had the exhibition of the educated fleas. And this is an original poster from my collection of the original exhibition of the educated fleas by Luis Bertolotto, Signor Bertolotto's original exhibition. Now, this is from the 1870s. This is when Bertolotto started in London. He toured around the world. He went to France, he went to Germany, he even went to the US, and this is a poster from his US tour. So it was really the hot ticket at the time. It was performed in front of the crowned heads of Europe. He used to say in front of and on the crowned heads of Europe. And we see some of those things that we've seen from those other postcards from the 1930s and 1950s of carriages being drawn by fleas, fleas pulling around a merry-go-round, the ballroom in which we have flea dancers, flea ballet dancers, which we saw in that video. Underneath each one of those ballet dancers, a little tiny flea with a collar wrapped around its neck, moving those tiny little things around. And so Bertolotto added this idea, which was showmanship. And by adding showmanship, well, he took this thing that had existed since 1578, and in the 1830s, he turned it into the exhibition that absolutely everybody had to see. So before then, people were getting a bit bored of the idea of watching these little chains, but Bertolotto turned it into the hot ticket of London at the time. Okay, so amazing stuff, and that's where it all began. And then flea circuses in that form became very popular right from the 1830s all the way up until the 1950s and 1960s. Now, we'll come to that in just a second. Why do these flea circuses not exist in that form anymore? But first of all, we've got to answer that question of why fleas? Why fleas? And why are fleas good for a flea circus? And so this is a beautiful engraving here. This is from Robert Hooke's micrographia from the 1660s. Really amazing engraving. And this is when the first microscopes became popularized, and Hooke produced these engravings of very tiny things that most people hadn't seen before. Now, the key thing here is that people hadn't seen these fleas in such detail before, and we can see some of the features of the flea that make it an amazing performer. So first of all, we have these incredibly long back legs compared to the rest of the legs there. And of course, fleas are very famous for their jumping ability. Now, we've got a video that I'm about to show you of a flea jump slowed down by several hundred times, right? So as soon as this pops up on your screens, the video is already playing. It doesn't look like it's playing, but I promise you it is playing. And so essentially this whole period of this video here is a fraction of a second. It's about the time it takes you to click your fingers. Okay, so there's the first one. I'll show you this another clip of a similar thing a little bit closer, and these are courtesy of Professor Malcolm Burrows, the amazing entomologist from the University of Cambridge, entomologist and physiologist, who took these videos in order to answer the question of how do fleas jump. Now, fleas are amazing biomechanical machines, and so the video has already started, by the way, again, so we're looking at real time slowed down by a factor of several hundred here, and we can see the flea, it's just building up its energy, and there in a fraction of a second the flea jumps. And so that makes a flea useful for things like kicking a football, or perhaps jumping around. And you will see, if you watch videos of flea circuses on the internet, there's amazing bits of footage of the wild fleas jumping around as well. So kicking a football was a common thing. And then that last thing that I mentioned right at the very beginning, the flea jumping through a hoop on command, and I'll show you a clip of that right at the very end. Okay, so fleas are amazing jumpers. Now, how do they do that? You see in that clip, fleas store that energy in their legs. So they have a special elastic cuticle called resilin, and they wind it up a bit like an elastic band. So they stretch it out and then they release it all at once. And that's why in that piece of footage, slowed down hundreds of times, the flea is building up its energy there and then jumps in a very, very short space of time. So fleas are designed by natural selection, of course, to burrow through the fur of their host. They're very robust creatures, which makes them very good at pulling things, and very tough, very strong little animals despite their size. But there's one more thing about fleas which make them useful for the flea circus. And so this is what links into Robert Hooke's micrographia, is that he really shone this light. He really opened up a window to things that people hadn't seen in such detail before. But at that time in the 1660s, and really up until the 1950s, everybody had fleas in their house. So whether you lived on the streets or whether you lived in a royal palace, you had fleas inside your house. And so we've got some amazing postcards here from seaside resorts. These are probably from the 1930s all the way up to the 1950s. Seek and ye shall find, a hot night. So when you went to the seaside, well, you would probably get fleas in your bed. And so most people were familiar with fleas, and it's why they were used in the flea circus, because they were easy to get hold of. Okay, human fleas. And the flea circus professors, as they were known, had a saying that I live off them and they live off me. Okay, so we'd use a flea. The flea would perform during the day, and at the end of the performance, so we can see from this postcard here from Larry Benner's Flea Circus, that the flea circus professor would roll up his or her sleeve and let the fleas feed on their arm. And so that was one of the reasons why fleas were used, because you can keep them happy, you can keep them healthy by taking one for the team and having them feed on your arm. So there we go. There's a reason why the flea circus used fleas in the first place. And for me, this is really the main reason why flea circuses in their original form don't really exist anymore. Okay, so this next image here is a photo from the outside of Len Tomlin's Flea Circus, which performed at Bellevue in Manchester, an amusement park in Manchester, and it closed in 1971, this flea circus. It was the last surviving genuine flea circus in the UK. Now, as part of my research, I've been in touch with some of the families of the original flea circus professors who've taught me their secrets of how to train fleas and how the flea circus used to run. And they tell me that it wasn't... the reason that flea circuses closed was not through the lack of audiences. People were still queuing up, even in the early 1970s, to see flea circuses. It was the lack of performers. So that caused the demise in the flea circus. And there is one thing that, for me, signifies the reason why flea circuses fell into their demise. And it's this next thing that you're about to see right now. It's the vacuum cleaner. Now, I mean this kind of literally and kind of metaphorically as well. So in the 1950s, of course, after the Second World War, well, hygiene and health standards started to increase, particularly in Western countries and around the world. And people started getting things like vacuum cleaners, which would hoover up all the flea eggs and the flea larvae from the carpet. And so the human flea, the flea that was robust enough to perform in the flea circus, became scarcer and scarcer throughout the 1950s and 1960s. And by the 1970s, the flea circus professors just could not get hold of enough performers. And so the reason that the flea circus went extinct, in my opinion, is kind of due to the vacuum cleaner, but also things like insecticides as well. And to the extent that I've never seen a live human flea. So human fleas in the UK, at least on humans, are almost extinct. Okay, but there is some good news for the flea circus, in that the flea circus still sticks around to this day. The flea circus still hangs around. And this next photo here is a photo that I took a few years ago at the Oktoberfest in Munich in Germany, where the world's last fairground touring flea circus still exists. Now, I understand that this flea circus uses cat fleas and dog fleas, but it still performs in exactly the same way as they have done for decades or perhaps even hundreds of years. And so with the knowledge that these flea circuses still exist, and with the knowledge that I gained from all of those flea circus professors that told me about how the flea circuses used to work, well, I started to do my own research into fleas and started to work with fleas myself. And I'm partway on that journey of recreating a full flea circus from start to finish. Now, of course, you might think the most difficult thing nowadays is getting hold of the fleas, and it's one of the most difficult things, but even more difficult than that, perhaps, is making the tiny chariots and props themselves. Now, in the original times, in the olden days, when people had mechanical watches, it was relatively easy to find a watchmaker or a jeweler to get hold of all of the tiny little props, the little parts, the wheels from the inside of watches, and to have those skills to solder them all together into tiny little carriages and chariots and tricycles. And so before I could start my own flea circus, I had to learn the skills of the historical watchmaker. And so I can show you some examples. You might be able to see them in the background here of some of the things that I've made. So there's some things in this photo here, but let's just grab one of these bits. And so I've got this is a £2 coin just for scale there, but hopefully you can see this. So this is one of the chariots that I managed to make, and it involved lots and lots of trial and error, soldering these tiny little parts together that were small enough and light enough to be pulled along by a flea. So there's a chariot. I'll show you. This is the tricycle. So this is the tricycle that I managed to make there. And then you can see that the tricycle works by the flea sitting on the barrel at the back of the tricycle, facing backwards. And as the flea walks along, well, the tricycle is propelled forwards. And then also things like these tiny carriages here. So it took a long time, as you can imagine, a lot of trial and error, a lot of training in order to make these tiny things. And so I've attached fleas to these things and managed to recreate many parts of the original flea circus. Including, I managed to take these on TV. So a few years ago on the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, I fulfilled a childhood dream of going on to the Christmas lectures that I'd watched when I was a tiny kid. I took on my genuine flea circus there, and we managed to find one flea in the middle of winter when we filmed it. I managed to film a flea juggling a ball on its back in this thing that you can see over here. So we've got a tightrope in the background. And we've got the thing that the juggling flea is attached into and juggles its ball in the background. Now, I did promise a couple of things right at the very beginning. Now, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions there about how we train fleas. And so we'll perhaps leave that one right until the end. But I did promise you, and I'm not going to give away all of the secrets of how we train things, of how we train fleas in the flea circus. But there was one thing that I promised at the beginning, which I would show you, that it's possible to train a flea to jump through a hoop on command. And so on this next image here, you will see this some footage of my flea circus in progress. So this is a flea with a collar around its neck, and the hoop goes down, and you will see the command, which is the small tap there, and you will see the flea jump through the hoop on command. And there it goes, the flea jumping through the hoop on command. And so it took me many hours to work out exactly how to train the fleas to do that. Now, you might be thinking, how do you get the fleas to do things if you can't get hold of these human fleas anymore? Well, the flea circus professors tell me that human fleas in their original form, in the flea circus's original form, were the only fleas that were robust enough to perform. Now, the human flea has evolved from probably from pigs, and from when pigs started to live in conjunction with humans. And the thing about the human flea is that it doesn't have to live on its host 24 hours a day. So if you have fleas on your dog or on your cat, you will see that the fleas live inside the fur of the dog or the cat, and they have to feed every hour. They have to constantly feed on the blood. Of course, fleas, the scientific name is siphonaptera, because they're kind of piercing mouth parts, sucking mouth parts, like a siphon that siphons out the blood from the animal itself. The fleas land on the animal, live inside the fur, and they suck the blood from the animal. Now, the human fleas do things slightly differently, because they've evolved from pigs that don't have very thick fur, in that human fleas live in the bedding of the animal. And so every time in the 1950s, if you had fleas in your bed, when you went to bed at night, the fleas would jump from the bed onto you, have a good old feed, and then go back into the straw mattress that you were probably sleeping on. And so I think that is the one thing that makes the human flea really robust. And that's the one thing that that led to the demise of the flea circus, when the human flea became less and less common. Now, I've experimented with all sorts of different fleas. I can tell you that cat fleas don't have any stamina Cat fleas don't have enough stamina to perform, but there is one species of flea that I do keep a secret that I've managed to find in order to train to do those tricks over there. And so we're almost coming to the end. I want to leave a few minutes at the end for questions, because it's always great to hear people's questions about fleas and flea circuses. But there is one more thing that I promised you right at the very beginning, as well as showing you that it was possible to train a flea to jump through a hoop on command. And that is that I promised you that I would show you, to prove to you, that a flea could make a Victorian lady take all of her clothes off. And so this links to, I promise this is family friendly, don't worry. This links to when I was doing my research into fleas and flea circuses, and I came across these sets of postcards called la pouce. Now, la pouce is French for the flea. So sometimes they're in French, sometimes they're in English, sometimes they're in German, but they all have a kind of common theme. They're all in sets of 4 or 5. And there is always this very similar story where there is some usually a very well-to-do posh lady with her young chambermaid, and she is saying, "I've lost a flea. There is a flea down my blouse." And then as the postcards go along, well, surprise, surprise. So there we go. Elle a sauté par là. La voici la coquine. There we go. I found the little thing. And just by coincidence, by the end, well, the posh lady's clothes have fallen completely off while she was looking for this little flea. And so I think that's what Victorian gentlemen did for their entertainment. They bought postcards showing how a flea could make a Victorian lady take all of her clothes off. And so there's a flea jumping through a hoop on command. There's a flea making a Victorian lady take all of her clothes off. And thank you very much indeed. I hope you've enjoyed watching and listening. And we do have a few time for a few questions. Yes, we've got about 10 minutes left. And so I know that we've got people wrangling your questions, and so I can see them popping up in the chat box here. A question from Rebecca Mason: how do you get their collars on? And so this is a really interesting question. How do you get a collar around the neck of a flea? Well, I use a very, very fine golden wire in order to do this. And I'll be honest, it takes a big magnifying glass and lots of swearing. Because it's a very, very frustrating thing to do. It's possibly the most difficult thing. You have to find the fleas, you have to make these tiny little props, but then you have to get a collar around the neck of a flea. Now, of course, I usually say that I offer a flea rescue service, because most of the fleas that I find are rescued from animal rescue centres, for example, when they're about to be sprayed with insecticide. And so I rescue from them from that certain death when they're about to be sprayed with insecticide. And so I need to tie the collar around the neck of the flea, but I need to tie it tightly enough so that the flea cannot escape, but not so tightly that the flea can't feed. And so it's a very, very delicate thing to do. So yeah, very, very difficultly with a big magnifying glass, and you just tie a small loop and just push the flea's head through that tiny loop and then attach them to these small props here. And then you can start the training process. So there we go. Hope that answers that question. Thanks, Rebecca. We've got another question here from Anne Valentine. Are human fleas much larger than animal fleas? Yeah, it's a really good question. Now, I've got some slides, some Victorian slides of Victorian human fleas. So the kind of microscopy was a big hobby for Victorian gentlemen quite often, and people would take specimens of insects and pollen grains and things like that, and they would mount them on microscope slides. So I've got some of these slides. And human fleas do look kind of more robust. Yeah, so they're a bit bigger and a bit chunkier than the cat fleas that you'll find on your cat. Are often very tiny, tiny, flimsy little things. So yeah, I think human fleas are slightly bigger. They're not the biggest flea in the world. We have some really, really huge fleas. So the cat fleas get perhaps 3 millimeters long, something like that. And we have a species in the UK called the mole flea, which lives, surprisingly enough, on moles. And it's the largest flea in the UK, and that can get almost a centimetre long, so about 8 or 9 millimetres long. And then my favourite flea is one of my favourite fleas is Hystricopsila schefferi. Get my teeth in to say that one, which is the mountain beaver flea from North America, which lives on this very primitive rodent. It's not actually a true beaver. So the mountain beaver flea is the world's largest flea, and that can get around 12 millimeters long. So a flea that is over a centimeter long. It's a very scarce species. I'm very lucky to have a few specimens of that in my collection. So yeah, human fleas are a bit bigger, but they're not the biggest fleas in the world. And actually, we do have a few extra photos here. So if we're able to move on, there is one flea which is simultaneously the world's smallest flea and the world's largest flea. If we're ready for a few gruesome pictures. So this is from a field trip I was on in Madagascar, and there's a thing called the chiga flea or the chigo flea. And I've actually got one of those fleas on my foot there. You can see it at the moment. Now it starts off, this is a bit gruesome, right? So this is if you're squeamish, well, look away right now. It starts off as the world's smallest flea, tiny, tiny little thing living in the sand all across the tropical regions of the world. And then it burrows into the foot of the host. And sometimes that host is humans. I managed to get one of these in my foot. This is my foot, you can see here. And then once the female flea has burrowed into the foot of the organism, she swells to perhaps 30 or 40 times her size as she swells full of eggs, feeding on the blood from inside your foot. And so the only way of removing them, and I did warn you that this is gruesome, so we can see the flea's head there, and she's a female flea there, absolutely full of eggs. So she starts off as the world's smallest flea, and then she ends up really actually the world's largest flea, even bigger than that mountain beaver flea, and leaving a horrible hole in your foot. So there we go, horrible, gruesome thing there when we're talking about large fleas. And so we've got a question from Robin here. How do you actually train a flea? Do they learn? Now, it's a really interesting question. Now, this is called The Secrets of the Flea Circus. I'm afraid I'm not going to give away all the secrets of the flea circus, but I will tell you that it is possible for insects to learn. And in fact, the thing that I've been working on, lots of TV shoots over the past few weeks, sometimes we do actually train insects to perform on camera. If you imagine trying to get a shot of a bumblebee flying onto a flower, how do you train that bumblebee in a studio to land exactly where you want it to land? And sometimes we have to do that. And so there are loads of videos online, loads of scientific research into bumblebees, for example, learning how to play football. It's, believe it or not, this is absolutely true. Google bumblebees playing football, and you'll see videos where bumblebees have been trained to do that. There's loads of historical evidence, scientific evidence of where if you reward insects with whatever it is that they're looking for. So with bees, it might be a sugary water, or with some species of wasp, it might be a juicy caterpillar to lay their eggs into. If you train them with a reward, you can, or if you reward them with what they're looking for, you can actually train them to fly in a particular direction, or to a particular place, or to a particular color. So it definitely is possible. Most people think it's impossible to train an insect, but it absolutely is possible. And so with fleas, it's a kind of combination of some of those things. Again, I'm not giving away all of the secrets, but there is a kind of training process and a selection process involved as well. So some fleas are just naturally better football players, and some fleas are just naturally better at pulling along the chariots, and so on. So there we go. Hope that answers your question. I'm going to leave that one there. So we've got some more questions filtering down through. Are they very intelligent? Really good question there from Anne. So are fleas intelligent? I always find it very difficult to answer the question of, is this animal more intelligent than the other, or less intelligent? We have these things called the IQ, the intelligence quotient of an animal, or the EQ, which is called the encephalization quotient. So basically, how big is an animal's brain relative to its body size usually gives you a clue. And so, of course, they don't really have a brain in the sense of a brain like mammals or other vertebrates might have. And I think it's a difficult question, because basically intelligence, our definition of intelligence, is just based upon humans. And so I think they're very clever. I think they're very characterful, but just in a different way to humans. So on human scales of intelligence, perhaps you might say they're not intelligent, but they definitely can learn. And so I think they're intelligent in their own way. So we've got some more questions coming down here. So from the Royal Entomological Society, and do check out the Royal Entomological Society. I'm very lucky to be on the outreach committee there, and a trustee of the RES as well, to do some brilliant things with insects all over the country. What other insect performers are there? So really good question. So you do see, of course, insects performing on TV. Watch a natural history documentary. Quite often things are shot inside the studio, and you'll see insects performing. I have another few historical references to beetles. So there's a reference to a beetle circus from the 1950s as well. But people have tried quite a few other bits. Cockroaches are trained on film sets and things like that to crawl around in a particular direction. But people have always come back to fleas. So they've tried beetles and cockroaches, all sorts of other things. But for some reason, fleas have always had the spotlight. So yeah, a few examples of other things. Some more question. Oh, so from Chris there. Chris has heard of dressed fleas. Can you dress a flea? What is a dressed flea? Well, yeah, this is another thing that I'm really interested in, and it gets clumped together with a flea circus sometimes. It's not really linked, but it's another quirky, weird thing to do with fleas. And there is a thing now. I'm lucky to have some right next to me, because this question gets asked quite often. There was a thing around the turn of the 20th century in Mexico, whereby ladies would make souvenirs, usually for American tourists, and they're called pulgas vestidas, which in Spanish is dressed fleas. And they would take fleas, dead fleas, so preserved fleas, and they would dress them in tiny costumes. And so I'm very lucky to have in my collection some original examples. These are over 100 years old, and so these are fleas dressed in tiny, tiny little costumes. Hopefully you can see those details. We've got some wedding couples there, and then over on the far end in Mexican traditional dress. And just because it's the kind of person that I am, that when I found out about dress fleas as well, it's again something that died out in perhaps the 1930s or the 1940s. So I thought I've got to teach myself to learn how to dress fleas in a costume. There's a famous example at the Natural History Museum in Tring in Hertfordshire. And so I have a set of fleas, and so I'm now very proud to say that I am the only person in the world who can dress a flea in a tiny costume. And so here are my dressed fleas there. I can't see if hopefully they're coming up on the camera there. So there's a lady and gentleman, lady with her parasol, and the man in traditional Mexican dress. So yeah, there we go. That's how you dress a flea in a tiny, tiny little costume with the steady hands of somebody who spent many, many hours putting collars on fleas and mounting tiny insects onto pins as part of my studies. So there we go. Let's have a look at the time. We've got a couple of minutes left. Any more questions there? Are we still there? We've got loads of people still sticking around, so it's great to see you all. So final questions here. Can ability be bred for? Can you select for chariot pullers? A really, really good question. Now, generally speaking, you can do that. So obviously we know selective breeding. It's why we have dogs as descendants of the wild wolf. It's why you can breed a Chihuahua and a Great Dane from the same ancestors. It's never been tried, so who knows? It's a really good question. Fleas are sometimes bred in captivity on a system called the artificial dog. Believe it or not, it's absolutely true, in labs for testing of flea powders and things. But yeah, we don't know. Excellent question. Okay, so last question here. Is there a book on the history or the secret of flea circuses? Well, that is a brilliant question. I promise nobody has I don't think I set this up in advance, but I am writing a book right now on the history of flea circuses. So all of my research, I've got this big collection of historical ephemera and all of the things that I've tried. So I'm writing a book right now. So watch this space. Follow me on social media. On Instagram, it's at Dr Tim Cockerill, and on Twitter as well. I'll try to log into Twitter again and revive all of that. But there we go. Yeah, so there isn't a book right now, but there will be one hopefully in the next year or so. So thanks very much. That is it. We've run out of time. Thanks for all your amazing questions. Thanks to the British Ecological Society and the Edinburgh Science Festival as well. Hope you've enjoyed that. Any more questions, get in touch with me on social media. That's it. See you again.